So today we will be discussing behaviour change in our horses and specifically signs of stress to look out for if we're having to move our horses to box rest. So for today's discussion, we're joined by Justine Harrison and Sophie Cookson-King. Justine is a fully certified member of the International Association of Animal Behaviour Consultants and is also registered as the Accredited Animal Behaviourist with the Animal Behaviour and Training Council. Justine regularly lectures for universities and colleges across the UK and has written numerous articles for various magazine publications. Sophie is a welfare operations manager here at the British Horse Society, and her horse Chuck is the focus of today's podcast. Sophie, would you like to start by giving us a bit of a background of your time with Chuck and what has led us to working with Justine on this project?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Justine, for
Thank
being
you for
with us. So, my horse Chuck, he is a rising 8-year-old quarter horse gelding. And in June last year, he had quite a catastrophic injury to his hind leg, his right hind, where he'd managed to get himself caught up in an electric fence, which had managed to lacerate his cannon bone just below his hock on the front. So from that, he was put on box rest following some vet advice, and I then noticed some really big behaviour changes in him. He became vet phobic, he became quite an anxious horse overall, needle shy as well. Massive changes to him. He was a very happy boy before and very comfortable with vets as well and having vaccinations, and that really all went out the window. His behaviour changed, and so I think it would just be good for us to have a chat really about what you think can help with box rest. I know we've spoken about enrichment previously, and then I suppose moving forward, how owners can look out for signs of changes in behaviour of their horse, and if there's anything in particular that can be helpful with that.
Yeah, okay. Well, sadly, I think these changes in behaviour are really common. And I was going to ask you, when you were saying about changes in behaviour, did you start to see signs of anxiety quite early on? Did he box walk or...
No, he didn't. He on the surface seemed fine, like he was adjusting quite well. When he was actually in the box, I made sure that I gave him different enrichment ideas. So we did things like I would hang willow for him, so he would have branches to chew on. He'd have a snuffle box. He would have different types of flavours of water in his stable. Bananas being smashed on different places within there.
That's amazing, absolutely. And not many horse owners would do that, so good for you. It's really interesting because I think different horses cope in different ways, or they don't cope. So some do seem to cope very well with confinement, and we've got to consider that confinement for a horse that would naturally walk long distances, we've got research that's showing that on average they would walk possibly up to 20 or 30 kilometres a day, but further research showing that they could actually walk anything up to 100 miles in a 24-hour period. And they're extremely social and spend time grooming and playing with their friends. So for them to be isolated in a 12 by 12 stable for days or even weeks at a time is incredibly stressful for them. So some do seem to cope quite well, surprisingly. Some can become extremely anxious, and we might see early signs of tension in the face, triangulation of the eye, changes in posture. We can see very obvious behaviours like box walking or trying to barge out of the door or calling to their friends, even if they've got equine company. And other horses do seem to, I want to say, suppress their behaviour and they can become quite depressed or go and hide in the corner of the stable or turn their back to the stable door. So we've got a huge range of changes that owners need to be looking out for. You'd mentioned that he was starting to become aggressive. Did he become aggressive to you in the stable, or was this just to the vet when you were dealing with the needle phobia?
Yeah, so he wasn't particularly aggressive with me, but he was withdrawn and not so keen for me to touch him, but he wasn't aggressive. The aggression came with the vet. So it first became that he became needle shy. So every time that the vet came to change his dressings, he wouldn't stand still. The leg was obviously painful. So then he would need sedation. And then that's when the needle shyness started. So he would then have to be injected rather than intravenously. They would do it in his muscle, which would obviously then take a longer amount of time for him to for the sedation to work. So I think then there was a lot of anxiety for him waiting, because he knew that something was going to happen whilst he was being sedated. And then the vet aggression came when after the needle shyness. So then, once he knew what was going to be happening and that they were going to inject him, he would then barge forward and try and bite, strike out, kick. So he became really quite distressed and upset when a vet would come.
How often was the vet coming out to see him?
I would say that the dressings would be every 5 days at first, and then they lengthened out, so then it would be usually once a week and then maybe every 10 days.
And we need to think that when their behavioural needs, so a behaviourist, Canadian behaviourist Lauren Fraser coined this beautifully, saying that horses need friends, forage and freedom. And in many cases, actually, when they're on box rest, all three of those areas might be compromised. And we are talking their basic behavioural needs. We also need to think about sleep and being able to regulate their own temperature and amongst other things. But being confined in this way, is so stressful for them that, of course, their mental well-being is going to be compromised as well. So we're starting anything that we do with them in this situation, we're starting with them having a baseline of being stressed and probably not tolerating things very well. And then on top of that, to have medical treatment and repeated injections will be so hard for him. You'd said earlier, what can we do to prepare them for this? And I think in many ways, it's almost impossible. There are things we can do. We can make sure that they are relatively relaxed about being in the stable, and when they are in the stable, that they always have something to do. They're not going to be bored. They're not anxious about entering the stable, and make a habit of giving them enrichment when they're in there anyway, so that they are relaxed. But of course, as soon as we start keeping them stable for long periods of time, that is going to change. I don't think there's any way we can avoid it. And if you do have one of those horses that isn't going to cope well with confinement, this is really tough.
So I would agree with that, because Chuck was absolutely fine with vets and needles. He didn't have any of those vices or worries or showing any of that behaviour beforehand. Yeah. So in terms of me considering preparing him for something like that, I couldn't have foreseen any behaviour changing, because he was fine to be stabled for the periods that he was. He didn't have any concerns with needles. He didn't have any concerns with vets. So that's something that I definitely would love for owners to understand, and for to not beat themselves up, saying, "Oh, I could have done this and I should have done that." Yeah. Actually, looking back at it, I don't know if there was anything that I could have done differently to foresee this behaviour change happening. And I think it would just be lovely for owners to understand maybe where they could go, or are there certain things that they need to look out for, the first signs that maybe then their horse is uncomfortable or their behaviour might start to change. Where should they go, or who should they talk to in that point?
So I think if they are starting to see any behavioural changes in their horse, if the horse is starting to become withdrawn, we've got to consider that they might be starting to become depressed. or if they start to become bargy or difficult to handle, if they're starting to have problems with the vet, as you said, which is completely unforeseen for you, then you can go and find a behaviourist, and your best option for that is to go to the Animal Behaviour and Training Council. And they've got a practitioner register that hopefully you would be able to find somebody in your area. And even if not in your area, I would imagine that somebody might be able to help you remotely.
So Justine and Sophie, you've both kind of raised the importance of being able to recognise those signs and behaviour changes early, and that they can be so different for every horse, that these changes can present in very many different ways. But if owners are starting to see those changes and they are getting a bit concerned, maybe they are looking to seek support from a behaviourist, are there other kind of alternative management practices we could be looking at, where maybe it's not just immediately going to box rest, or we can look at things around management that aren't just confining them to the stable?
Brilliant question. I think that the first thing any owner should do when a vet is prescribing box rest is have a conversation with them about, is this absolutely necessary? And we have got to keep in mind that this is so tough for horses that many horses aren't going to cope with it. And this is the reality, I'm afraid. And of course we've got to consider that there are people that do have horses that don't have stables. And in those cases, the vets will say, can you tape off a corner of your field? Or if you've got a field shelter, can you close the front of it off somehow? And these horses do manage fine. Yeah. Any inside-outside area, actually, I think is also a really good alternative. It may be that your yard is set up in a way that you could easily cordon off an area in front of the stable, so at least that they can go in and out, and they've got some choice, and they feel like they've got choice to be in or out, and they're not confined behind a door. Alternatively, can we tape off, create a small area in the field where their very important though to consider, their friends are going to need to be close to them somehow, because if they're closed in a small taped off area in a corner of the field and their friends are off somewhere else, we may end up with them just leaping out.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think Sophie, you can probably feed into this, because I know with Chuck, he's struggled with being just stuck on box rest. So how's that kind of adapted in your management going forward? Yeah,
definitely. So I did actually find it quite difficult in the real initial stages of him being injured. My vet practice was absolutely fabulous, very supportive, but I had different vets treating him at first. One thought that he would be fine just being in a small paddock. The other one thought that he should be on box rest. So I had even differing opinions from vets at the same practice as well.
That's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so in the end, it was decided that his leg needed to be completely immobilised, and so the box rest option was taken, which obviously led to these events that we're talking about now. But interestingly, Chuck treated me yet to another injury in April this year, where he broke his splint bone on his left fore. And because he had previously suffered from lymphangitis from his other previous injury, the vet suggested that he absolutely should not be put on box rest again should this leg blow up. So it was decided that he would just be on paddock rest. Fantastic. And actually where he was at his yard, that was a mixture of paddock out at night, and then he would come into his stable during the day. And that's worked brilliantly. His behaviour, he's on the same routine as the rest of the yard. His behaviour hasn't been impacted because of that. We've been able to keep his weight down because he's been able to be out moving in a small paddock as well. He's been turned out with other horses, so he gets that interaction. And then he comes in during the day, has his sleep, has his hay net, so he seems a lot happier this time. So it shows that I think usually a broken splint bone would be treated with box rest, and actually the x-rays are showing he's healing beautifully. So it shows that it can be done in different ways.
It's also really important to consider that when they're stressed, their immune system is compromised. So we actually have immunosuppression going on, which will mean that it will take longer to heal. That's really interesting. So if we're seeing signs of stress, we really need to work out how on earth we can improve that. Another thing I was going to mention is it is really, really important for them to have equine company. If they're going to be on box rest, we need yards to get into the habit of bringing horses in shifts, I want to say. I kind of call it visiting hours, but they're going to have equine company, because I've seen a number of horses that have developed behaviour problems as a result of being on box rest. For example, one horse who was incredibly relaxed, probably one of the nicest horses I've met previously, had one day of box rest and has developed separation anxiety, which is really, really tough to deal with. I don't know how far we're going to get with this, because he was left on his own. He panicked. He I'm not going to say box walked. He ran round the box, and when the owners rang the vets, they said no, he must stay in. But of course, he was moving so much. It was actually really, absolutely contradictory, really, to what they were after.
That's really interesting. After one day as well, I wasn't aware that it could have that be that kind of quick and the impact.
And so now he panics if different horses move in front of his stable or leave the yard, and he naps. He's not happy to leave the yard. So there are other problems that can come out of box rest. So equine company, really important. Even changing environments. So, okay, if they have to be on box rest, can they be tied up outside for a period of the day with another horse next to them? Can they go into a different stable? Just so that they've got a change of environment, so they're not feeling like they've got the one view, that they're actually moving somewhere else. Or walks in hand. I know that you've taken him out for walks in hand, haven't you? Were you able to take him out to walk from the outset, or did he have a period which was strict box rest?
Yeah, so for his first injury, he had a period of strict box rest, unfortunately. So that, I would say, lasted for at least 2 to 3 weeks, where he was just in the box 24/7. I did do things like would take him out and he'd be tied up somewhere else so he could interact with different horses, or he'd be put in a different stable for a bit to have some different smells whilst he was being mucked out. And then he was able to have some walks in hand, as in just hand grazing. And he was good. He was excitable. But then this is the other thing that, of course, everyone's had it, where they take their horse out to graze in hand and all of a sudden they're flying a kite. And that's really not going to help any injuries or stress levels for anyone. So something that I did implement was that he would be on box rest, and then for a period of the day he would be turned out in a small paddock as well. So again, it was just getting him back into that routine with the rest of the yard. And then because of the lymphangitis, he actually ended up being turned out 24/7 between 2 smaller paddocks. So again, I feel that there is other ways that we can get horses to relax and rest and immobilise whatever they need to immobilise, but can do it in a much nicer way than just being kept in their stable 24/7.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, when you initially took him out for walks in hand, was he all over the place? I mean, was he?
So at first he was fine, actually, and then it's almost like he realised that there was some freedom, and I think the longer it went on as well, that he knew that was his period of time, that he was out and doing something different, and then would have to go back into the stable. He did start to he would call out, whinny, trot about. He wasn't horrendous in any way. I know I've heard of other people with really struggling with their horses' behaviour when they hand graze. So no, he was relatively okay, to be fair to him, bless his heart.
I think this is fascinating. So this is really a psychological phenomenon called post-inhibitory rebound. And if horses, or indeed we are exactly the same, if we're restricted from performing any of our basic behavioural needs, then once we get the opportunity to do it, we'll perform it more than we would do ordinarily. So if movement is restricted, then as soon as you bring the horse out, they're going to move far more than they would do normally, because they've lost that opportunity to do it. And so no matter what we do, if the horse is on box rest, this is a massive risk. It's a massive risk. And so we've got to be very careful about taking them out for walks afterwards. You are so lucky. But this is completely understandable, you know, and it is going to be a real struggle for horses to keep themselves under control, I want to say.
Yeah.
So we could think about things like making sure that if you walk out that you've got another horse friend. I know this is a lot to choreograph, and you really need supportive members on. And this is something we really should talk about. We need supportive people on the yard that are willing to offer their horses and to help if you are wanting to go out for a walk, or indeed turn them out afterwards. Even walking your horse to the field will be much easier if you're following another horse or you've got another horse behind you. And I think if horse owners started thinking about how they can help other horse owners, everybody's going to end up in this situation at some point. And we need to be supporting each other, really. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think that supportive network is key, just to horse ownership, isn't it, really? Just having that kind of, those people that you can really turn to. Yeah. And I think, like you say, that change from management, where we're moving from box rest, that's another significant change in our horses' routine and our kind of horses' management. And I know you kind of said around having that support and having people there that can kind of work with you with their horses, but are there any other kind of tips, I guess, that you can give in terms of preparing for that transition? So if we have had a horse that has just been on significant box rest, where they haven't had any turnout, or maybe it's even rehabilitation back into work, are there any kind of tips that you maybe support with horse owners to make that transition as smooth as possible?
So, I mean, just the practicalities of moving them from one place to another can be really tough. So things like following another horse, or even if they are completely unmanageable, you can have a horse on either side and almost walk them as a group. That can be really useful, and have somebody on either side of them. I've had great success with horse owners just putting a line of feed bowls to the field, just with a couple of treats in each, and they'll walk from one to the other. And because they've got their heads down, they tend to be more relaxed about doing that. You can ask your vet for pharmaceutical help.
Sophie, have you found anything with Chuck in terms of his process to rehab and increasing work?
So something that I found quite helpful, he was actually fine really on being turned out to the field. Something that we did was kind of zigzag some fencing into his field, so he had to move around the fencing, so he couldn't just get in the field and then absolutely bolt to the other side. He had to manoeuvre his way around, which helped slow him down. And I found that really, really beneficial. And I was lucky in that I didn't need any pharmaceutical help in that sense at all. That bit was probably the easiest bit for Chuck, actually. The bit where I struggled was his behaviour with the vets. And then moving forward, I found that he was then not only needle phobic, he then became very fearful of clippers. He then didn't want to have fly spray put on him. So it was almost like anything touching his body, he became very, very cautious about that.
So this is very common with particular fears that horses have. So in this case, we've got him being afraid of needles, but what might happen is if that fear response is big enough that they may generalise to anything that appears similar. So approaching him with clippers or approaching him with a fly spray, and that might not just be the vet, then that can kind of bleed back to being you as well. And so then he could become fearful of anything that looks similar to you or a human approaching him with something in their hand. The good news is you can undo this. And again, I would say get in touch with the Animal Behaviour and Training Council, find a behaviourist. But also, when these problems are starting, so if he was starting to, let's say, not stand still or become nippy when you're having the problems with the vet, that's the time really to call the behaviourist and to start. They could give you techniques that will make the process easier in the moment, and hopefully then the behaviour wouldn't escalate to the point where he would generalise and we've got problems with other husbandry tasks.
That's really good to know, because that's something that I felt quite out of my depth with, is seeing his behaviour change. And I work for the British Horse Society, and I felt out of my depth. I'm surrounded by knowledgeable people. And so I can completely see how actually if you're an owner and don't have any previous knowledge of a horse's behaviour changing for whatever reason, where to go. And the problem is, as well, is that the secondary thing, this was costly as is. So I was thinking, could I get the vets to come out and just be with Chuck when they're not treating him? Well, that's again another call-out fee, and that felt quite costly and overwhelming at the time as well. So it's just good to know that actually once those behaviours start, it is better to nip it in the bud rather than see it progress and get worse, as unfortunately I did with Chuck.
And it can get so costly. I completely understand. One thing I should mention is if the vet is ever on the yard for another horse, it is a good idea to ask them to come over, give your horse a treat and a with a scratch. So because they're going to smell different, they're going to look different. The horse will know that this is a vet appearing. So, and that's a very cheap way of trying to keep them on board with having vets approach them.
Just making it all a nice experience.
Yes, we've got to try and pair whatever that awful experience is with something really positive. Food is a very good way of doing it, but also with the scratches, or if you know where your horse's favourite itchy spot is, if the vet can turn up and give them a scratch, that's fantastic. That's going to go a long way to helping.
So Sophie, is there anything that you felt you kind of specifically went to in terms of support for Chuck through this box rest process, especially as maybe it became a bit more difficult for him?
Yeah, so I think a really important thing that a change that I made was to his diet. Completely reviewed his diet and the amount of energy that he was getting. So the usual thing of soaking hay, he's a good doer anyway. So soaking hay, I would put that in little hay nets as well around, so he had different areas to pick at, and also reviewing the hard feed that he got to just a handful, just to take his medications that he needed. He was basically taken off all of his hard feed and just put onto a really basic nut so that could carry the medications. And actually that did help any weight gain that was happening, and also his energy levels as well, which is why I think he was okay when I was taking him out to hand graze. There wasn't this huge explosion of energy from him, which I found really useful. And also I made sure that I continued on with all of his usual care and management. So he was still seeing the farrier as regularly as he was, and also his different therapists, his bodywork therapists as well. He was seeing that. He was becoming tight across his back and through his hind end as well, where he was compensating because he was in pain. So alleviating some of that, I think, was as much help that I could give him at that time as well. And also that was a nice time for him to relax as well, him getting a bit of a massage and having some stretches as well. So I just made sure I continued on with those as well.
Brilliant points. Really important to think about diet. And also, just when you were saying that, I was thinking about so many horses that, let's say, might have laminitis and be on box rest. And so we'd be looking for low-calorie alternatives for enrichment. And there are a number of foods that you could give them that aren't going to be dangerous on that. So even thinking about things like lettuce or berries, that you could provide them provide as enrichment for them. That's going to give them a choice of flavors and tastes and textures and smells, even something different in their stable. Also, brilliant that you're saying that will have had such an impact on his leading behaviour. One of the things that I do see that is a problem with a lot of horses is that they aren't very good at leading before we even start the box rest process. Right. So I think it's really important for people to consider training their horse to lead well, because if they're not going to lead well before we start this process, that you're really going to have problems at the other end. So just make sure that your horse will stand for you, just using very light pressure, and reward them. Give them a wither scratch, or you can give them a handful of grass nuts or something like that when they perform the behaviour. Also turning left, turning right, again on very light pressure. Practice in your arena at home, and just get your horse really good at stopping and walking on command. I think that's vital.
Yeah, no, really good point. I think we've had some excellent discussion. I've really enjoyed listening to you both. But just to kind of finish, is there any kind of key points that you'd want to finish on, just for horse owners to really take away from this discussion? What would be like the key highlight for you?
I think my first most important point is, do they really have to go on box rest?
Yeah, ask that question.
Yeah, and don't be afraid of asking your vet. As I said, there are many horse owners that don't have stables, and this isn't an option for them, and their horses do manage very well. The other thing is, if you do start to see any signs of behaviour change, talk to your vet and ask then if they're some way down their healing process. I want to say, try and get them out as early as as early as you can, and also to make sure that they've got equine company at all times and that they've got something to keep them occupied. Food or enrichment, really, really important.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, from an owner's perspective, I would agree with you, Justine, on that. Just, is box rest necessary? Is that the only option? Because I don't think it always is. I think there are other options. And again, although it might feel quite scary at the time, but if you know your horse and you believe that actually box rest could be really detrimental to them, talk to your vet about that, and don't be afraid to raise your concerns with them. And even if that might then just be reducing the amount of days or weeks that they're on box rest, that could be beneficial. And then lastly as well, to just say that it's a scary thing going through it as a horse owner. It's a really tough thing. So just for horse owners to be aware that there is help out there is support out there, and just to seek it, to not feel like you're totally alone in this change of behaviour.
It's really hard. I mean, we've been talking about it being hard for the horse. It is incredibly hard for the owner. And even just that it's a massive amount of work. And then to see your horse in that position and to feel in some ways helpless as to be able to do anything.
Completely agree.
There is support out there.
Yeah, I think that's the key takeaway, isn't it? Is that we're not alone in this process, and there is definitely support we can be calling on at these times. Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us. I think we've had a really important discussion, and I'm really glad that it's a conversation that we're having. So this podcast has been created in a follow-up series of some blogs supported by Justine Harrison, and you can find these on the BHS website. These focus on improving the box rest process and looking at different enrichment that we can use for our horses. We also have an upcoming blog on rehabilitation, so we'll be following Chuck's journey a bit further, so look out for that one. These can all be found at bhs.org.uk, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to meet you both.